Welcome to Bold Agendas. In this episode, I'm honored to host Professor James Murphy, a distinguished scholar in economic geography at Clark University, where he's the director of its Graduate School of Geography. Professor Murphy's research examines the social, economic, and geopolitical forces shaping economies and cities with a keen focus on how to achieve more just, sustainable, and resilient development in the global south, particularly in Africa. As a scholar and the editor-in-chief of the internationally renowned journal Economic Geography, he has significantly contributed to advancing scholarship in geography and related fields such as development studies, economic sociology, and sustainability transitions. His extensive work offers invaluable perspectives on Africa's evolving economic landscape and its implications for global business leaders. I think you'll find this a timely and fascinating discussion, and we welcome Jim to our show. I'm Mimi Brooks, and this is Bold Agendas, Africa, the Next Frontier. Let's get started. Jim, welcome to Bold Agendas. I'm so excited to have you join us today. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited about this.
I am. I have to tell you, you'll find this interesting that this is the first podcast that I'm doing since I started it several months ago, where I picked the topic and we went and found the person who knew about the topic. So as opposed to I picked the person and we tried to figure out what they wanted to speak on. So this idea of understanding how business leaders should be factoring the possibilities and the economic promises potentially in Africa was something that I wanted on the show this year. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. Thanks.
So let me start with when you were referred to me as an economic geographer that specializes in Africa. That was the first time I had heard that field of study. So I just wanted to take a moment, if I could, and let you explain to my audience, what that's about and what exactly your role is and perhaps why you decided to specialize in Africa.
Yeah. The really simple answer is economic geographers are all about studying the wheres and why there's of anything economic. It could be markets, it could be production, it could be distribution, logistics, you name it. And, in contrast to economists, we're much more about places and connections between places than, say, individual decisions and margins and things like that, or macroeconomies. So we're about what makes places distinct and differentiated across space, across the planet. And so for a perfect example is like, why do we have a place like Silicon Valley? Like what makes Silicon Valley this epicenter for global innovation? And why is it so difficult to replicate that? And so that's just a perfect example of a kind of question that we ask as economic geographers. And some of it has to do with, location. Some of it has to do with the ways proximity between people and firms enhances the buzz of ideas and innovations that go around. So it's things like that we look at, and we look at global value chains and supply chains and how they touch down in different locations. For me, Africa became a passion because I started my life as an engineer, actually, and after being in the corporate world, actually, as a chemical engineer, I decided to change gears, and I went into the Peace Corps. And I was a Peace Corps volunteer in a tiny country called Malawi. It's somewhere behind me here. And it's I spent 2 years there, and then I became a passionate Africanist, somebody who was really interested in questions of development in Africa. And then I discovered economic geography as a field to study those, to study how growth and economic development and innovation and creativity, which I'd seen in the ground in Africa, could really be understood better through a scholarly lens and through a lens of sort of theories and concepts that we use in geography. And geography was a perfect field for me. It was something that, I always had a passion for, but I did the first generation college student thing where I went right to the most profitable job I could get. And now I'm in the least profitable area for where I'm at. But that's great. I love what I do, and I'm really, really fortunate and privileged to get to do it.
And how often do you get down to the continent, Jim? Do you go, most years, or what does your schedule tend to look
It's
like?
been a while because of COVID disrupted everything, and but I had been going annually, particularly to East Africa, to Nairobi. So I spent a lot of time in Nairobi, but since COVID, it's been really challenging, both in terms of getting the resources to do the research in Africa, as well as just the general um, inertia that kind of got created with the COVID disruption. So it's been a little bit of time, but I've been continuing to research the continent, and I've been working with. We just finished a book on African development, a handbook of it, and we just finished another book on the urban question in Africa. This is with some co-authors. Who are based around the world. So I'm very much engaged with the continent, but I haven't been able to be there, which is really unfortunate. And so I'm hoping to get back again this summer, maybe.
Oh, good for you. Good for you. So, Jim, when I was putting together my notes for the conversation, it's such a big topic. It could be a discussion that we could take so many different angles on. And so, what I tried to focus on, were the ideas that might be of most acute interest to our business leaders as they consider growth opportunities, growth marketplaces, how we think about talent pools going forward. So I'm going to try to stay a little close if I can to these, questions around what would business leaders need to know as they juxtapose the potential opportunities on the continent to their growth business strategies, over the next 5 years or so. So if you're good with that,
Yep.
I'll go ahead and jump in and get your thoughts. So why don't we start with the concept of, the economic landscape in Africa, and maybe we can just, cover a broad brush first of, what is it about the economic promise or opportunities that you see as likely relative to the continent, and how business leaders might think about the possibilities there.
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's sort of demographic trends, and then there's the economic trends, and then there's some of the geopolitical dynamics that are playing out. Demographically, I mean, Africa's growing at a more rapid rate than any other place in the world. By 2030, over half of all new workers in the global labor force will be in Africa or Africans. Today, over 60% of all people living in sub-Saharan Africa are under the age 25. And so by 2100, 40% of the world's population will reside in Africa. So that's a pretty large market, right? Um, it's predominantly going to be an urban continent by 2035, which means we now have these concentrations, which of course are a big deal for geographers, because economic geographers, because it's those kind of concentrations and clusters of firms and people that create sort of innovation opportunities, and they mixing and diversifying, and ideas flow, and industries grow. And then some of these cities are going to be absolutely enormous. So by 2015, there's going to be at least six mega cities. These are over 10 million population cities, including Lagos, Nigeria, and Addis Ababa, and others. Kinshasa, sorry. And then the other thing is we're starting to get these megalopolises that are emerging. So like we have a megalopolis in the United States from Boston to Washington, D.C., basically. Well, we're having a similar kind of megalopolis forming in West Africa that's basically linking Abidjan and Ivory Coast down to Ghana and Nigeria, and so this is a huge coastal configuration that's going to be a center of markets and economic development.
So
Um,
the big
yeah,
ideas there, if I can
yeah,
say, because I think you made a lot of big points. The young population, the percentage, 60% under 25 is a tremendous number. So that's a big idea. But I was also reading a bit to the point that you're making, that urbanization is a big factor here, right? In terms of how that's creating, quite a ripe environment for, commerce and capabilities in these fast growing urban areas. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. And I think the challenge has been the industrialization aspect that normally is in lockstep with urbanization hasn't been emerging. So we have kind of a phenomenon in Africa right now where we have urbanization, but without industrialization. So a lot of the jobs in cities in Africa are service oriented jobs, and they're often informal jobs. So these are not formal sector wage employment or contract employment. So that's one of the challenges, is how to break out of that kind of structural challenge that these that many economies in Africa are facing, and to go into a manufacturing space.
Yeah, I was going to say, so, why don't we, pursue that angle too, so we can kind of put it together with the demographics and the shifts in urbanization where people are living and hoping to work. So how do we look at it from an industry perspective? What industries do you think are going to be the fast growing or are the fast growing industries? And which ones might offer some promise to balance the industrialization challenge with
Yeah.
the urbanization opportunity?
Yeah, several that I've kind of thought about, and I mean, some of them are not necessarily urban based, but they can obviously help support cities. Things like horticulture and commodities like that, fruits, vegetables, and things like that, that could be part of developing supply chains, particularly to urban centers, where there's an increasing reliance and rise of supermarkets and shopping malls. So a lot of consumption services, a lot of consuming going on in these cities, but African economies haven't been able to capture the supply chain aspect of that. So a lot of these economies are still importing uh, goods that they could produce locally, and importing them from places like China. So I think there's a big market there for those kinds of products. I think when you look at green energy and renewable energy, this is something that I think when if we talk about leapfrogging in Africa, I mean, I think this is a strong potential for African economies to kind of bypass the kind of fossil fuel directionality that we generally see Western and Northern economies go through. And then fintech, ag tech, med tech, anything that's kind of associated with apps and mobile phone technology. Everyone's got a mobile phone. People are increasingly savvy with the use of these things, particularly those under 25 people who have grown up and had mobile phones pretty much their entire lives now. So platforms are ubiquitous. I think there's a lot of areas where these can be really good investments for companies in terms of things like how do you use apps to help people get better health care? How do you develop apps that can help farmers know the weather and make planting decisions and harvesting decisions more effectively? How do you and then the fintech aspect, right? There's a huge market for fintech. We can start with the mobile money revolution that occurred in Africa around M-Pesa and other apps, but now it's getting deeper and deeper into things like insurance and other kinds of savings and investment services. So I think those are some really growth industries. I think there's obviously some trade-offs with some of that in terms of, like some of these apps can actually be problematic. Like if you get into like gambling apps and things like that, that
Oh,
people, right? So that's a challenge. But I think there's a lot of really interesting social type enterprises as well that have emerged. Like one of my former students is one of the leaders in an NGO social enterprise called Paygo Energy. And what they do is they use apps and technologies related to cook stoves in informal settlements to provide cooking gas, which is a much healthier alternative to burning wood or coal or charcoal in a cramped space. Last thing, education. I think educational services has a really strong potential. Young Africans are so keen to get skills and credentials, and the problem they face is they can't afford to come to Clark University and be educated in presence on campus here. For example, we just had our admissions process. Over half of our applicants for our PhD program, which is a top-ranked PhD program, were from Nigeria and Ghana. That's like
no
yeah,
kidding.
over
That's
half of them.
interesting.
So folks are really trying to develop their careers. They want to get credentials, they want to get skills, but they often don't have many opportunities to get those locally.
I think that when I was reading about this a bit and it aligns to, the industries that you're mentioning, one of the things that struck me as something that I didn't understand as a possibility is this adjacent industries coming together to do a leapfrog opportunity like agritech and renewable energy. So when you think about those opportunities that might enable, as you said before, the opportunity to get in front of the use of fossil fuels and some of the environmental impacts of that as they're trying to get, some energy coverage, across the continent in reliable ways. So those all seem like, interesting leapfrog opportunities to not necessarily have to, forge paths that historically we know create longer term issues for us in terms of
Yeah.
developmental impacts.
Yeah, those are
Yeah.
absolutely the case. I think the other thing is any kind of sort of decentralized, like service provisioning technologies and companies that can provide sanitation, they can provide water, particularly in cities, because you have to understand that these African cities have boomed in such a short period of time that there's really not been much effective planning. And this ability to deliver what we call the modern infrastructure ideal, that is, everybody has a water, uh, gets water the same way as everybody gets energy the same way as everybody else, is not necessarily realistic or affordable in the context of sub-Saharan Africa. But consumers, obviously, the consumer population is growing, the middle class is growing, and there's a huge demand for these services. But we need the innovators and the people to develop these ideas around delivering these goods and services in more sustainable ways. And I think that a lot of Africans are working on this in different technology hubs and stuff, but they don't have the investors.
So why don't we hang there for a minute and maybe put together two of the thoughts then? The geographic and demographic, I'm sorry, nature of the population that you talked about a moment ago in terms of the 60% of the population being 25 and under, along with some of the industries that have potential or are in the process of growing. So how are these young people affecting, the trajectory of the region economically?
Well, they're consumers for one thing, I think, and I think they're more cosmopolitan consumers than I think their parents were, and so I think they're very much aware of the global economy. They're aware of what's going on. They can communicate with folks around the planet. I get emails all the time from the region, so I think in one sense they're a different kind of consumer than their parents. Their parents may have been more traditional. Their parents may have been really the first generation for independence for many of these countries, and so they don't see themselves as kind of trying to, reproduce this kind of traditional kind of Africans modes of consumption or livelihoods. So I think in that sense, they are driving a lot of change. There, for example, we have a increasing number of middle class Nairobians who are now investing in agricultural production. So they're kind of diversifying their portfolios and also helping to kind of address questions around like food security, for example. So they're investing in these urban areas and these rural areas. They're city dwellers, so they're kind of urban farmers, but they can now do this at a distance because of the technological changes that have occurred. They can monitor and track and their crops and their farm managers and things like that. So it's really created this really interesting kind of drive to diversify the economy and diversify individuals' portfolios, as it were, as basically an insurance policy in a volatile context. Sometimes, where they've basically,
Smart.
yeah, right, exactly, right, and so I think that's part of what we're seeing. And again, these are folks who are very much like they see what's happening with the tech universe in the United States, and they admire that, and they really would like to sort of be able to do the same in Africa, to develop those kinds of hubs. And we have these innovation hubs that have emerged in pretty much every major city in the region, where you have people really kind of doing really creative things and innovative things. And again, they need the financing in many cases, and they need the investors.
I think that what's interesting about what you said is that, there's at least two things that you cited that I would imagine are misconceptions of potentially of business leaders today. One being that there's an idea that we have an absence of the middle class. It seems like that's, not exactly, a good assumption anymore, right? And the second one is that the region is both immature and perhaps not ready for innovation. So I'll pick up on two things that you said and ask, what else do you think might be commonly held misconceptions about, the interests of the population and the readiness, if you will, of people to adopt new ways of working?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, those two are certainly there. I think the corruption mythologies is one of the challenges as well. When we talk about a lot of my courses, like what is corruption, and corruption is a complicated idea. Like what's corruption in Ghana may be very different than what's corruption in the United States. And so, but I do think there's a kind of perception that it's just too much of a slog to get started there. There's going to be too much hassle, too many transaction costs, too many negotiations, too much bribery or something like that. So I think there's a kind of that kind of legacy of some, let's be honest, there haven't been necessarily fantastic governments in Africa for much of its post-independence period. But I think there's a lot more transparency today, and there's a lot more pushback, I think, from this new generation to really get more transparent, good governance and to do business in a way that's actually going to attract investors from Europe and the United States and elsewhere. So I think that's one of the things. I think the second thing would be to add would be about the idea that the only secure investments in Africa are really in extractive raw materials, oils and minerals, things that are like strategic commodities, like coltan, for example, that goes into Teslas and things like that. So I think that is one of the challenges, because I think what investors don't see necessarily, which is something that I've seen from day one when I started working in Africa, is the investment you need to make is in its people. Its people are really quite remarkable, given the challenges and the legacies that they've had to deal with. They're innovative. They are capitalists. They are entrepreneurial. They want to achieve. They want to grow businesses. They want to have better houses, better cities. And I think that, but they need investment. They need people to invest in them, and invest in that, in developing that labor force and developing that next generation of entrepreneurs.
Just one thought before I go on to the capitalism issue, because I read about that, so I have a question for you on it. But before I leave the misconceptions, what about this idea of a homogenous entity? People thinking that when we talk about, the continent and, ideas that we apply them broadly, across the continent, kind of inappropriate to, what would be a more realistic or fair way of thinking about the region.
Yeah, I mean, this is it's a classic thing that people do, because there's a lot of information they're trying to process, and they simplify things, and that kind of makes decisions easier if you simplify things, and you don't have to think too deeply about it or become too knowledgeable or get a PhD on African economic geography. Um, but I think it is a remarkably diverse continent, and I think that's the thing. I mean, it's got 185 languages. It's got all kinds of almost 50 countries. It is just full of this diversity and difference, that can be tapped into in terms of different kinds of investments, different kinds of sectors. I mean, the other thing to realize as a potential investor or business leader is, obviously, there's these colonial legacies. So you're going to have differences that are built in. Like if you go to West Africa, much of that's going to be French speaking, francophone based. There's going to be, Nigeria an exception, Ghana an exception. If you go down to Southern Africa, you of course have South Africa, which has a very unique, highly differentiated history to it. And then the southern region is a different kind of region, where you even have Portuguese legacies in places like Mozambique and Angola. And then in East Africa and Central Africa, you have the Belgians. And so you have all these different kinds of European cultural influences mixing in with these differences in just the ethnicities and tribal affiliations of people. And those things come also with institutional legacies in terms of the way governments operate, the kind of business cultures that have emerged. So, in many cases, a challenge for businesses is to understand how to read those cultures, given what we know is a culture that's very Anglo-centric, US-centric, of course, in the US. And like, how do you translate that into a context like, investing in a French-speaking former French colony?
If we can, it's so interesting to me. If we go to this idea of, capitalism thrives here, it's very interesting concept. And the language that I saw for that, which I thought was interesting, was referring to this as
Yeah.
Africapitalism,
Yeah.
right? Is that the common term? And are we talking about, when we say that, are we talking about the pursuit of private investment in the region, or like what would be the scope of that concept?
Yeah, so that concept comes out of a particular one of the biggest business leaders, and I'm not remembering his name right now, but but the basic idea of Afrocapitalism as a concept is trying to pursue private wealth accumulation, but do it in a way that reflects on this idea of the kind of the unity of Africans and the solidarity, and this idea of that if you become a wealthy corporate leader, that you have a kind of responsibility to give back, right? So it's kind of a socially responsible way of thinking about capitalism that isn't just about individual accumulation, but it's about reciprocity and giving back to your community. And so that's kind of what the Africa capitalism concept is supposed to be about. And part of that is to say, rather than the state, that actually this could be a better means of actually developing Africa. If the
Oh,
business,
got it.
right? So
Yeah,
if
interesting.
so, because the state hasn't necessarily been very successful for a variety of reasons in facilitating that. So in a way, it's an aggressively capitalist kind of idea that, but is one that still has this almost more like socialist kind of tendencies to it, but coming from like
Right.
corporate leaders, right?
That's what I was going to say. But, very grassroots, right? I
Yes.
mean, it sounds like we're talking about a grassroots, cyclical, social, economic, process in terms of, how do we grow by working together and supporting each other and reinvesting in ourselves, essentially, is what we're saying.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. Oh, I like that. Um, so maybe I can move us over, to this idea of how would business people navigate this environment, in
Yeah.
order to find, the opportunities that might be of most interest to them? And then how do they deal with some of the likely challenges
Yeah.
there? You want to kind of take it at a high level and then we'll drill
Sure.
down?
Sure. I mean, I think it is something where you're not. It's not a place you're going to leap into and suddenly start making big money. I mean, you're going to have to become knowledgeable. You're going to have to kind of do some sort of kind of immersion into the kinds of the context you're dealing with in order, like any business, anytime you invest in a foreign investment, you're going to have to do this anyway. You're going to have to know what you're investing in. You're going to have to know where the trap doors are. You're going to have to know where the opportunities lie, and you're going to have to be prepared for a bit of a slog. It's going to be a more incremental process to begin with. I think some of the challenges are, so a lot of that's about culture, and not like tribal culture, but just the culture of doing business and the way business has been done in the region. And then questions around the political culture as well. So I think understanding how the regulatory environments operate, and then where there could be opportunities to take advantage of that, or where you maybe need to be prepared to have some investments or upfront costs that you're going to have to deal with. I think the other thing is informality. I think one of the challenges for business people or anybody first going to sub-Saharan Africa is it seems really chaotic. It's in cities, like it's congested. It seems chaotic. It seems disordered. And it's very informal in the sense that these are people like street traders and people working in informal factories, micro enterprises, and things like that. So I think that that's something that you have to kind of come to terms with to some degree and understand, and not see it necessarily as a problem, but just as a kind of reality and an opportunity, because I think many of those people doing those kinds of informal jobs want a formal job. They want a job where they have a formal wage, and they have benefits and those kinds of things. So I think that's one of the things you have to kind of get comfortable with, that noise and that the honking and the there's a lot going on. It can be stimulating, overwhelmingly stimulating in some ways. And I think some of the other challenges that you need to deal with are things like finance. I think finance can be a real challenge, and there's a lot written about this. About one of the limitations on investment in Africa has been the lack of finance, and some of this relates to deficits and debt that countries have had, where they don't really have the capital in the banks, that in the commercial banks in particular. So I think that's something else that has to be navigated. I think there's ways to deal with the finance issue around, there's international organizations that can facilitate financing through like the World Bank, for example. There's also, if you're doing something that's more like a social enterprise project or investment, there's funds that are these what they call them impact investment funds, like Acumen, which will invest in these kinds of projects. But funding within African countries can be a challenge to get, and the interest rates can also be kind of high. So I think that's definitely a challenge. But in terms of the last thing I'll say, in terms of kind of getting started, I think a lot of this could be working with people, the diaspora. African peoples are everywhere in the United States and Europe nowadays, and a lot of them are working in corporations. They're all very interested in educating people about where they come from. And if they're in a corporate environment, I'm sure they're interested in seeing about how to facilitate investing in their countries if it's relevant for the corporation or corporate entity they're working in. So I think that's a great way to start. Work with folks who come from the region, who are interested in business in the region, and let them advise you, let them guide you.
That's what I was going to ask you. You just were starting to get in front of my question, which was for companies that have been successful, and to your point, they know going into it that their likely intention needs to be that they're playing a long game. I mean, that's what you're saying, that it's likely a long game. So what have you found, in terms of some of these right moves that companies have made in making the decision to go in? I like, for example, the idea of, do a 360 network, around partners, both in country and in continent and outside. That's what you were saying before, right?
Yeah.
So, and in that context of relationships, are there things that the governments are doing or other types of industrial partnerships, to try to bridge some of the gaps, the initial, adjustment period and setting expectations so that missteps are avoided?
Yeah, I mean, there's like you'd expect anywhere. There's chambers of commerce, there's manufacturing associations, there's trade expositions, and that happen all the time. And so those are the kinds of things where you can start those dialogues, and the people who will tend to be in those organizations will be, first of all, people who are really interested in attracting that outside investment, and they're going to be more familiar with the kinds of business cultures that folks in Europe and folks in the United States may be used to, operating in. So I think you want to, and I think that's a really safe and smart way to start, to not try to think you're going to like jump into an informal market and start talking to people and start a business up. I think that's one way. I think there's also these established innovation hubs, and I think they're just really interesting to go to, just to see what these really innovative, skilled African business people are thinking about as really great opportunities for businesses. And I think you learn a lot there. For example, I had a visit to the iHub in Nairobi, and there was a woman there who was working on developing an app, which a lot of these folks are doing, that would work with the public transportation system in the city, which operates through these. It's a complicated bus system, but it's still very cash oriented, and that creates all kinds of problems with, corruption, basically, where people will take more than they should to the owner of the van. And so she was developing a mobile money app for that and things like that. So there's, and I think the other thing to think about is you may be smaller on margins, but then if you think about that, the population growth that's going to happen in the region, it's that price times quantity kind of thing you need to be thinking about. What is that really going to look like? How much of a smaller margin would you be okay with given the volume?
So, Jim, if I wanted to wrap up this part of the discussion around opportunities and challenges, if I said that it seems potentially likely that most business leaders would see the new frontier and growth opportunities that would be possible in Africa. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone that this market is going to, present opportunities for global businesses for some time to come. So the issue then seems to be, when to go in, versus if we should go in. So these factors of obstacles to the when equaling now versus later seems like perhaps, the idea that would have to be overcome. So if you were going to make, your best argument for why going in sooner, might be more uh, lucrative in the long run or position the organization better in the long run, versus waiting. How would you describe that might encourage people to rethink their timelines?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to keep in mind is, well, of course, right now there's so much uncertainty and volatility that making any kind of risky international business decision, I think, is that's a whole other issue that's separate from
Yeah.
Africa itself. But I think one of the things to realize is that China is already deep in Africa, okay, and China has already and in many respects, I think that the China approach to investing and doing business in Africa has been appreciated by Africans, but I think Africans, generally speaking, still look to the US and Europe, US in many ways, as more of the kind of idealistic kind of leader in terms of what they want their economies to potentially look like, what they want their countries to look like. But that said, the ground, the market access has already been taken up, a lot of it, by Chinese firms who figured out how to navigate that space very efficiently, in part because a lot of these firms are state-owned enterprises. They have that patient capital. They don't necessarily
Yep.
need to have a quarterly earnings report that's going to knock their stock price out of the ballpark. So I think that's one of the challenges, is that I would say, if you want to get in, you want to get in now and start sort of seeing how this is being done effectively by some of these other firms. But so that would be one of the arguments, to say there's already a lot of lost ground here in terms of that market access, and the question is, can that be reclaimed at some future date? It's hard to know, because first mover advantage is pretty big in these things.
Yeah, I was going to get into, how China has been early here, invested heavily, and now it's like, what does that mean to anyone else coming in after that in terms of, what headwinds they might experience. But maybe I can ask, just as a precursor to that, is if I pull the lens back a little bit, how would we think about, Africa's fit in the changing dynamics of global trade, and geopolitics? And I realize that that is a question that you might have to make, in a very current sense, as we've seen changes that I imagine have rippled down, through Africa with some of the changes in U.S. policy. So I'll let you talk about that, maybe, a bit more, historically, and then very recently, in terms of what changes you might be seeing.
Yeah, I mean, historically, during the first period of the post-independence period, of course, Africa was a kind of was able to play both sides of the Cold War in some ways, in some African countries, quite effectively, in the sense that they had resources, and both the Soviets and the U.S. were anxious to get access to those resources, and to win over those countries, as it were. That didn't necessarily result in great governments. It didn't result in great leadership, or anything like a developmental state that was actually promoting industrialization in Africa. But Africa had a fairly significant role at that time, and that's part of the reason why we had a much larger foreign aid budget, supporting places in Africa and other parts of the global South at that time. What's happening today is interesting, because it's sort of like, we've been, my colleague in Ireland, Padraig Carmody, and I have been working on this, about this idea of global China, and how this is potentially creating a kind of potentially a new Cold War, where it's now, where we have, and then Africa's kind of, in terms of its resources, its extractives, is again playing a more powerful role in that. Particularly as the Chinese geopolitical machinery becomes more militarily inclined. They have their first naval base is in Djibouti. It's a small base, but that's one of their first foreign military posts that they've established. The question, though, is whether or not this new geopolitical landscape is going to be good developmentally for Africa, or if it's just going to kind of go back to the same kind of geopolitics that played out in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And that I don't know. I think it's going to depend on the ways in which governments can kind of leverage this tension between U.S. and China, and make it work for them and their people, as opposed to more of a kind of patrimonial, like more like just keep me in power kind of power dynamic that isn't necessarily good for development or for industrialization. So for me, if this is going to work, it's going to have to be these geopolitical relationships are going to have to be channeled or translated into uh, skilling and upgrading labor in terms of getting workers to the place that they need to be ready and able to be workers in investments in firms and factories and service providers from the U.S. and Europe, for example. So I think that's the real challenge, is whether or not they can channel these development these geopolitical tensions into upgrading and skilling workers, because of the and because that labor pool, it does need skilling and upgrading in order for it to be more attractive for investors.
What about the geopolitical issues that are associated with the continent still having 30% of the natural minerals, of the planet there, and how that plays with some of the decisions that you're seeing play out on a global scale. I realize that we don't want to, overamp on just that part of the, assets of the organization, but obviously of the continent, but obviously it's quite a big deal right now. So how do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, the investments are basically, as you note, and they're asset oriented, not market oriented, essentially.
Yeah.
And this is historically it's a pretty well established playbook. It's called the resource curse, and it means, like, just because you're sitting geologically on a gold mine, literally, or a diamond mine, or an oil well, that has historically not been necessarily good for development. There's exceptions to that. There's places like Norway, that have been able to leverage their mineral wealth into real development, but that takes a really forward thinking leaders, both in business as well as in governments. And I also think it really is something that I think the corporate world investing in Africa would want to think about, not just doing necessarily superficial corporate social responsibility initiatives, which aren't always superficial, but they can be in some cases. And thinking more strategically about sort of developing new kinds of supply chains. How do you take that mineral and have value added to it locally, and that could be a win-win for both the country you're investing in, as well as for your own business. But that's a but I don't know if Wall Street necessarily you know uh, rewards that in the
Yeah.
short run. So this is one of the challenges. It's that temporal scale, and I think that's why China has, because it's had a different kind of ability to be patient with its investments, has been able to play this longer game. And I think there you are seeing more, like in places like Ethiopia in particular, where you're seeing a lot of people getting factory jobs and in shoe companies and things like that. And they are developing those kinds of skill sets to do more labor intensive manufacturing work and the like. So I think
I
that's
think
really one of
that's
the
an
challenges.
interesting point.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting point to look at those opportunities, as I imagine China did, beyond just extraction, right? That's part of what you're saying here in terms of developing a more holistic approach, to the investment in order to,
Right.
gain agreement and support from local people
Yeah. I
and
mean, no,
opportunities.
absolutely. And so China, you know, a lot of the U.S. and Western approach has been the extractive side. So we want the
Right,
resources, but
right.
China's smart to know it's the imports as well. And so we produce, so they get both sides of that trade equation. They get the imports and they
Smart,
get the exports. Yeah.
smart. So I don't want to, poke you someplace that you don't want to go, but I just, want to give you an opportunity, if I didn't ask you directly, if you've observed any early impact in the region of some of the U.S. policy changes of late.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't personally observed, but I think the USAID impact is lethal in some cases, literally, and it's gonna impact the economies in the region, because this. it's the USA budget is less than 1% of the federal budget. I think that's important to highlight. And yet it's still a sizable budget that supports a lot of public health initiatives, as well as other kinds of initiatives in the region. And I think what's going to end up happening is you're going to have sicker people, and a sicker workforce is not a more productive workforce. And I think that's one of the challenges that I think is going to be coming down the pipeline. And I don't think my other concern is that the way that the continent is going to be dealt with as far as geopolitics and foreign policy is concerned, it's going to be more about deals, like one-on-one deals between countries, and those, where you have this enormous, powerful country like the U.S. is going to be working to make deals that are favorable to it, and that's realpolitik. That's been going on for a long, long time, regardless of the administrations. Um, but the wider developmental stuff that needs to be supported through organizations like USAID is going to disappear. And then the question is going to be who's going to be able to step up to support that. Is it going to be private philanthropy? Is it going to be the EU? Is it going to be China? I mean, it's a really interesting question. And what does that mean for our relationship to this huge economy, this huge market that is the region? Is it going to actually uh, make that relationship worse for the long run? Or is it gonna, is it gonna somehow be okay? I don't know. I just don't know.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting because you said before that, people locally are predisposed to seeing capitalism and US entrepreneurialism as something that they relate to, that they'd rather see there. And so besides the systems that, are being disrupted, you worry that, that sentiment on the ground could be something that we could pay for even a potentially longer period of time. What do you think, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, again, I mean, it's also important to keep in mind that compared to Europe and China, we have a relatively small footprint in the U.S. in Africa to begin with. So I think that and partly it's because of the reasons we've already talked about some of the challenges of starting out there, and that we don't have a historical connection to Africa as much as we do like to a place like Mexico or Latin America and in those regions. And so I think so the question is whether or not we're just going to be seen really as less and less potentially relevant for business,
Right.
and because we're not right now super significant in terms of what we do investing wise. But I think if we're thinking ahead to that 2100 and then the percentage of the planet that's going to be African, I think we may be a bit myopic in not in basically being seen as somebody who just wants to take the resources, but not actually to support the people.
Yeah, you could see that. Like you said, if our interests become very localized, local industry, very localized, as places we can win here, we can win there, we can win
Right.
here, but it's a Swiss cheese kind of
Right.
approach, right?
Right.
Relative, to the region at large. And then your question, who provides the glue? Because that's what it is, right? Who provides the horizontal glue? And if it's not, at least in part, the US, um, it's probably going to be somebody else. And the question is, public, private, where would it come from? Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. Jim, I would be remiss if I didn't ask the question around emerging technologies and, in particular, autonomous um, uh, transformation of automation and AI. What are you hearing about that down there, and how are you seeing interest?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the main area it's going to be coming into is in terms of these apps and the mobile technology aspect. Where AI is being incorporated into these things. Not much on the robotics side at this stage, or that kind of automation. Um, there's a recent book that came out that talks about this is not necessarily being the best for workers in Africa and other places.
Oh,
There's I haven't read the full book. I just kind of saw it. So I need to read it carefully, and so I don't want to say what the book is yet. Um, but I think it's really interesting. So one of the things that I think there is a lot of potential for AI is in that skill training and the capabilities of workers. So what can it do to overcome maybe some of the educational challenges that maybe workers may have had because of their context of their countries and the educational systems? that it may facilitate making those workers better able to perform certain kinds of tasks in the factory, in an office, or what have you. ChatGPT has become, endemic, and it's become a challenge because in my world, we still write our own work. And so when people are now using ChatGPT to write, research papers and things like and applications to our PhD program, that creates kind of problems. But on the other hand, I mean, they're not going away, and they serve an incredibly valuable purpose, and they're being integrated into everything nowadays. So I think that there's an opportunity potentially, I would see, to leverage some of that AI and some of those technologies maybe into ways that can kind of take these micro enterprises, individuals, and kind of formalize them more. And some of this, there's been some work on the idea of these platforms that can actually empower individual workers. They can also disempower them depending on the platform. Um, and the question is really whether or not AI can be used to kind of support those workers being able to participate in the formal economy in new ways, and ways that are actually effective and productive for the businesses that invest. So I think that as you know, AI is the Wild West right now. We don't know where it's going to be next week, next month. It seems everything's got it now, but what does it actually mean for development in a place like sub-Saharan Africa is still an unanswered question.
And I feel like what you might be also alluding to, I just want to make sure that I'm hearing you on this, Jim, is that when you say that is AI and automation going to be a positive force here, you mean is the normal concern about people displacement as a result of AI something that hits this region particularly hard due to the immaturity or lack of readiness of the workforce? So would there be an disproportionate hit on that before some of those talent plus industry um, hurdles can be cleared to get people fully employed in long-term sustainable jobs? That's what you're pointing
Yeah,
to.
and it's the skilling versus de-skilling question,
Yeah,
right? So is
yeah.
this gonna because is this gonna actually upgrade the value of workers that are gonna then enable those individuals and their families to have sustainable livelihoods and social mobility into the middle class? So I think that's what we don't necessarily understand. A lot of the sort of early sort of ICT and information communication technology stuff that's kind of happened in Africa has been really like really low wage kind of things. Like we're going to look at two pictures of lawnmowers on the Amazon that are on the Amazon website and make sure that those are the right images, or stuff,
Oh,
things like that. So there's been this
yeah.
kind of outsourcing of this kind of digital work, but it hasn't really translated into a deepening of the informational economy in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's a lot of it's been more what we call in the book I wrote with Parag, thin integration. So it's a thin integration of these technologies, mostly around communication and maybe money transfer, direct relations, but not really informationalizing the economy where like people are doing incredible things to understand like poverty issues or economic development opportunities through things like big data and the like.
That's fascinating. That's an important point, right? Because, it seems like there's a lot of concentration in the same use cases
Right.
almost again and again. That's what you're saying, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that'll be interesting to watch to see how that unfolds. So just as we think about some of these big pillars, what about sustainability? How does that play in terms of economic development, and how much of an emphasis or concern is that on people that are investing? Is it a mature idea? Is it hit and miss? I mean, where would you see it?
We definitely see it in some areas where we get, for example, in South Africa, particularly in the Western Cape region of South Africa, there's been a lot of interest in establishing the Western Cape as a hub for green economy innovations, green energy, and things like that. So I definitely think there's pockets of this, and then in terms of the horticultural agricultural sector, there's a lot more interest in like organic farming and more community oriented stuff that can fetch a premium in the global markets. And then, high value commodities like cacao and chocolate, basically like how do you, producing those in ways that can be deemed as socially and ecologically sustainable. As you can imagine, though, it's a challenge when you're in a challenging material situation for people to be able to focus more on these environmental issues. That said, however, climate change, I do believe it's actually real, is going to disproportionately hurt Africa's ability in many parts of Africa. And so there's a real demand for innovations and investments in adaptation and resilience. How are countries going to, especially coastal countries, going to do a sea level rise? How are workers going to be able to work productively in extremely hotter temperatures in many of these areas? How is the energy system going to be able to support hundreds of millions of people who may be needing air conditioning systems and things like that in order to sort of be productive and healthy. So I think that's a huge sector. I think is another area where you could potentially see Africa being able to kind of leapfrog in many ways around really innovative but maybe more decentralized solutions to the challenges that climate change is gonna produce, like around drought, for example. A lot of sub-Saharan
Right.
Africa depends on what they call the intertropical convergence zone, which is the annual rains. But if that's going to be changing, that means the length of the rainy seasons are going to be probably decreasing in many areas. So, what kinds of technological investments can be made to help farmers deal with shorter rainy seasons? This could be both from agribusiness. It could be from people who work with information communication technologies, meteorological systems. There's all kinds of areas that could be prime for investments. And I think that's kind of one of the differences I say about Africa. It's like it's not like I think business leaders need to be thinking more about the vital essential needs in some ways that you can actually deliver and still make profits from. In terms of being able to provide better systems for people to be able to have clean water, to be able to have reliable energy. And I think, and again, you're not necessarily. It's like the vaccine industry in a sense. They don't make a lot of profits, but absolutely essential for people's lives. And I think and so I think there's a different kind of way you need to think about what kinds of profits and the rates of profits you would expect, but then think about the size of that market.
It seems that the point that you're making is that business people probably need to get a bit creative about how to make the business case for these investments, because you're describing opportunities that are inherent in the environment, leapfrog opportunities, climate based opportunities in terms of sustainability, et cetera. The question is, how do you make the business case for those investments, and think about them on, in the short and longer term?
Yeah.
They're not quite as obvious. I mean,
No.
it's a bit of a challenge, right?
Absolutely. I mean, and again, it's and some of this is kind of something you alluded to earlier. It's sort of, you may be needing to intersect with areas that you haven't traditionally intersected with in terms of the like technologies. Like, well, I'm in agribusiness, but I don't really do anything about like meteorological stuff. But maybe you need to kind of figure out how to get in that space. And we call it in economic geography, we call it related varieties. So these are different things, but they're related, and they can create the next wave of innovation and growth.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. In our world, we would refer to it as as an ecosystem view, right, of the environment, and it does pull in these adjacent opportunities that might not be as obvious initially, but if you think a bit more long term and shared interests in a wider ecosystem than just a vertical market, you might find opportunities to make investments, useful and probable in the shorter term versus the longer term.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I want to wrap this up, but I want to go back because I had a question at the very beginning that when you said the number of applications that you have into your PhD program, I wanted to stop at that point, but I figured let me keep going. And but you made the point that one of the challenges for students there is being able to travel in order to, get the U.S. education that perhaps other developing countries and continents might be, more able to do. So my question is, given the applications that you've seen, how will people, if accepted, enter the program? Would they be remote? Would they be hybrid?
Yeah.
How would that work?
Yeah, our program is in person and it's a doctoral program, so it's different. But even our master's degrees are tend to be in person, or are in person, I should say. So that's the typical model. So one of the challenges, of course, is that folks don't have the financing, and then we're now going to be facing probably visa challenges for people getting visas to come,
Right.
which is going to probably happen. But anyway, I think what I do think there's definitely a high demand. So a lot of universities now are they're globalizing the university campus where they're setting up satellite campuses, and this was particularly happening in Asia, around those markets. So a lot of UK universities and US universities to some degree have set up campuses. So like the University of Nottingham has a campus in Jingbo in China, and so to tap into those markets. In the case of sub-Saharan Africa, I think and increasingly, we're seeing a lot of these micro credentials. For example, there's one of our the big companies in the geographic information science space is called ESRI, and they have a whole micro credential program. And you can be certified as somebody who's knowledgeable in a particular kind of geospatial analytic technique or whatever. So I think and some of those skill sets, if they're done right and they're done with quality and they're done with actual like rigor of sorts, they can actually help to remotely build that workforce and set up that workforce for jobs that are higher value. A lot of the applicants we had were interested in geographic information science, which is a really booming area, and it's one of our specialties, and we're a center of excellence for that. Um, and they have skill sets already, and these are highly significant skills if you're doing planning, if you're doing conservation work, if you're doing developing things like smart cities or what have you. Like these they're not just mapping skills anymore, they're analytic skills, and a lot of them are actually, quite frankly, AI central. Like they're AI's geo AI is a huge field.
It makes sense,
So
of course.
yeah,
Yeah.
so there's things like that I think is a huge opportunity for investment. And again, people, the demand is just off the charts. I felt so bad. Like we had 230 applications. We only accepted 7%. So that's how competitive our program is.
Wow.
So it's one of those things where, you're basically saying no to most people. And then, that we just don't have the resources to be able to support 100% of their travel and tuition for a master's degree in particular.
Jim, I imagine that given what you said, that you switched careers to get here a long time ago, starting with the Peace Corps and then moving into academia. And I'm just going to guess that that your work is a combination of an academic and economic interest, but I imagine it's got to be also a social interest, for the people on the continent. So, maybe you can leave us with something that's more in that genre, about the humanitarian opportunities here, perhaps to play a longer game and what it might mean to the people of the of Africa, as well as the long-term play of businesses
Right.
in the U.S. and Europe, to partner here more aggressively. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, lots of thoughts. I mean, it's interesting. So for me, I hadn't really been anywhere. I was a Jersey guy, working class, first generation college kid, and I just kind of ended up in Africa because that's where they assigned me, and it was just so transformative because you see the way how hard people are working and the difficulties, especially in the country I was in. Malawi at the time was under a dictatorship. It was the poorest country in sub-Saharan Africa, pretty much, and it was. But even in the context of that, people were still like making it work, and they were still able to kind of laugh and love and live together in ways that were really just deeply community oriented and about solidarity and stick to itness. And I think that's the thing, I mean, that's the people. And I never, it's funny because I haven't really been on many safaris. I think I went on one trip to a game park once. I saw a big crocodile. It was really great. but I really haven't. And it's because I just have always been more interested in the people in the community and the places. And I think that's and that's kind of my passion, and it's become my passion and much of my career. So I think what that means is that I think there's so much more in terms of the externalities that we can create just by engaging with people in the region. I mean, the Peace Corps is a highly inefficient system for development, in the sense that most of us, we don't, we pretend that we're changing the world, but it's us who gets changed the more so. And I think that's the thing, is we become more familiar with these places and these contexts. Then we see them in different ways as investment opportunities, as well as diverse, complicated contexts of wonderful people trying to do the best, like everybody is trying to do, the good people at least, in the world.
It's fascinating. It's like a humbling experience that became kind of a lifelong, both passion and career.
Very humbling. I was schooled so much about what I didn't understand about the world. And I think the other thing, last thing I'll say is, development work, humanitarian work, there's humanitarian work that's, we have a famine, we need to feed people. Okay. That's
right.
One thing. Development work is not, it's a long-term process. Yeah. And I think the goal of development work should be for development workers to get themselves unemployed, at some point where they're not needed anymore. Unfortunately, that hasn't been the case. Despite what's been happening with USAID, we still need those people. But it's a long-term thing, and it's never going to be like business in that sense. But if business people understood some of those structural and institutional and historical challenges associated with some of these contexts, I think they can actually be more confident and better prepared to invest and do business in this region. And I think, and by the way, anybody who wants to ask questions of people like me or other people who are doing ask us. We love to talk about this stuff. And a lot of us know, not me necessarily, know a lot about regulatory environments, about economies and markets and trends and innovations that are going on in the region. And I think, one of the things I've been really frustrated by is I feel like I do a lot with more of the NGO community in terms of the communications and the development community, but not the business community.
Well, I love that you said that, honestly, Jim, because, one of the reasons that I started this podcast was to try to get communication across the chasm between academia, policy, business, because it just seems that the issues that we're having everywhere in business, social context, geopolitical context, these are issues that bleed across the divide,
Absolutely.
and we need, best ideas coming forward, and the different vantage points, I think, help give us a fuller way to solve the challenges that we find ourselves in today and that are likely tomorrow. So, the idea of stakeholder capitalism, I'll say that, across the board, seems like a model that we should be triggering more in order to share good information.
Absolutely. And I think academia, to be honest, we've kind of lost track of being able to do that too. And I think that's something that I think that's part of the reason we're in the crisis we're in right now, is because I think we haven't done a good enough job about reaching across across that chasm and trying to build those relationships.
Yeah.
And I think that, so, bring it on.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I hope that we'll all get better about that. And I just want to put an explanation on, Mark, on the point that I think you were making a moment ago, because I think it's a very big point. And that is, I feel like what you're saying is, even though aid may be a part of the dialogue, and there's a lot of good that it can do, especially in this transitional period, this transitional time of trying to get people from aid to development, you're not trying to confuse aid with economic development and the value proposition of that.
No.
And I think that's a good thing to both see differently, and then see potentially how those ideas working together, could create, long-term prosperity for businesses and communities everywhere.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm
Absolutely.
with you. Jim, it's like a million things to think about. I could talk to you for a long time, but I want to thank you for coming on sincerely. And, we'll make sure that we provide when we do this your email or contact information,
Okay.
as part of the video so people will know how to get a hold of you. I'm looking at my producers, I'm talking. And because I'd like to, have people have the opportunity to follow up with you if they'd like.
Great.
So
Great.
thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
And I appreciate it. And we'll have you back some other time to give us an update.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
Bye now.
Thanks, Jim.
Bye.
See you.